While this podcast will cover information about how to access therapy and other mental health services, it is not intended to be a substitute for said services. This podcast is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. If you feel you are in need of mental health assistance, please seek out licensed professional care in your area.
Not that type of therapy podcast. Hey everybody, it's Charlene McPherson. This is Mental Health Quest episode 21. Today we are going to be talking about child and family therapy as well as couples therapy. Again, I introduced myself already, but I'm going to do it again. This is Charlene McPherson. I'm an LCSWC and a certified therapeutic game master. And of course, as always, my lovely co-host is with me.
I am Benjamin Tice. I am a registered psychological associate and psychology doctoral candidate. And we are so very happy and honored to have two amazing guests with us. You guys might have already known about them because you've seen our social medias when we were their guests. But please introduce yourselves, our lovely experts on therapy with families and children and couples.
Hi, my name is Hannah Espinoza. I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor. I'm trained as a marriage and family therapist. I have been in the field for about 8 years. And I also am a co-host of Popcorn Psychology.
Hi, I'm Brittany Brownfield. I'm also a licensed clinical professional counselor. I've been in the field, I think, 11 years next month, which feels crazy. And I'm originally from Ohio, but I've lived here in Chicago and practiced here in Chicago for about 9 years. And I'm technically a child therapist, but I work with all ages and families and couples.
Lovely. Thank you guys so much for joining us. This is a really interesting episode. For our listeners who might remember, I think it was like episode 2 or 3 or something like that, where we talk about like the different kinds of therapists. And already we have here in this virtual room, we have individuals on 3 different kind of like therapy classifications, I guess. Like I was going to think of it as like a D&D class, but it's not. Yeah. Because, Charlene is a licensed clinical social worker. Mm-hmm. And then Brittany and Hannah, you said licensed clinical professional counselor. And I'll be a psychologist eventually. But I'm in IRB hell right now. So, but can you guys start off by explaining what is the difference between the licensed clinical professional counselor versus any other kind of like therapist class thing?
Well, I can talk about that because I know, Hannah, you also have the additional license of AMFT. So licensed clinical professional counselor is what people think of a lot of times when they think of a therapist, like a mental health therapist. There isn't a license. I'm sure you guys have talked about that. The only kind of licenses like that are like massage therapists, occupational therapists, which I didn't realize was such a confusing thing for people until when I started telling people I was a therapist, and they'd be like, oh, physical therapy? And it never occurred to me that I would have to specify therapist when I tell people.
Yeah.
So licensed clinical professional counselor is the independent license. So to get an LCPC, you have to work for 2 years, at least 2 years or 3,000 direct hours. You take a stupid test that has nothing to do with how good of a therapist you are. I just like to tell people that. I failed it by 3 points the first time, and then I passed it by 3 points the second time. So even with 3 months of studying my little head off and a lot of anxiety, I still only did a 6-point margin. I like to tell people that because people don't talk about not passing those kind of tests enough, and that it has literally nothing to do with how good of a therapist you are. The questions are like
bonkers.
I don't know, made in some sort of vacuum by a computer probably.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so, so basically, I don't really know how much it differs from an LCSW. I work with a lot of LCSWs. It feels like we do the same thing once you get to a certain level of experience, unless you choose to specifically go down the social worker route, as in like case management, caseworker, things like that. That's my understanding, because when people ask the difference between LCSW and me, I'm like, I don't really know how much of a difference there is, because I I feel like they do the same job I do.
Yeah.
I just assume what we learn in school is slightly different, but I don't really know how much different it is because I never took that grad program, obviously.
Exactly.
And like I said, I work alongside LSWs
Yeah.
constantly and always have.
Yeah, I don't know either, honestly. That's I'm like, we do the same job. And like, honestly, like you said, at a certain level, it's like, okay, like, you know, when you're not independently licensed, obviously there's a lot more rules and stuff like that to you doing therapy. But like once you hit that independent level, you're pretty much doing the same things as what your colleagues are doing, and they might have, you know, different licenses. Although I will say the psychology and the counseling have got their stuff together because the psychology's already passed their state compact. So like they can go across state lines. They can do therapy across state lines, whereas the LCs, we haven't done that yet. And I don't know about the counseling yet.
Well, with the psychology, it's not all states yet. They're trying to get it. It's only like less than half of the United States right now has the interstate compact and California does not have it. So like even if I get licensed, I would not be able to do that. Basically, in order for me to do that, I would have to get licensed again in whatever state does it, which I think Illinois is part of it. So like I would like get licensed in Illinois and then I could work in whatever state has a compact. With Illinois, which is like, that's a lot.
Yeah, that's the only difference I know of right now. It's just where each of our things are at with the interstate compacts.
Mm-hmm.
And when I've worked with LCSWs and I've talked to them about the differences in their programs, it seems like one of the biggest differences is either you get as many counseling classes as someone like me took, or you have only like 1 or 2 counseling classes. That's what I've heard in terms of the differences with the training programs, with the grad school programs. But yeah, I don't really know the other difference besides the fact that LCSWs take a different exam than we take.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's as stupid as the one that we take that is pointless. And by the way, I passed by 1 point.
Yeah.
I don't even know if they gave us our points. They just told you if we passed or not.
Well, it's dumb because it's 2 parts, and I got like an A+ on 1 part every time, and I just wasn't passing by that tiny margin. The other part, it's not comprehensive. And like, I remember when I went to take, and you have to wait 3 months, which I'm sure is similar to you guys. And I remember when I had to wait to take it again, they give you case studies, sort of, like scenarios. I remember the same one showed up, which is Mark Jacobs. That's why I remembered it. That was the name of the client. And I remember thinking, I can't remember what I put last time. And like almost starting to have like an anxiety attack of like, what if I put the same wrong answers? So actually what I did the second time, because I was trying to be very mindful of this, is between each case study, or maybe even each question, because you get 3 full hours, I made myself do grounding. Like I made myself take 5 deep breaths with my hands together to recenter and ground, and not, because when I get anxious during those things, I start answering impulsively. And then I start really like going on a downward spiral and just like going too fast, which now I know I have undiagnosed ADHD. Well, now it's diagnosed, but it was just diagnosed 3 months ago. So I understand some of these habits better and why I needed to like do grounding when I was in those kind of moments.
Yeah. Also, they're looking, at least in Maryland, they're looking to get rid of the first licensing test, like when you get your master's, because it's so biased, culturally biased, that it's real bad. And so they're like, we need to get rid of this stuff.
Wow. I didn't even that's so amazing to me that there's like 2 different licensing exams. Like for psychologists, we'll have like, technically there's 2 exams, but it's 1 license. Like it's like you have to take the EPPP and then you have to take the law and ethics, because the EPPP is like a nationwide. It's the same exam for everybody in the country. And then you take the law and ethics for your specific state, and then you get your license for that state. But it's like, but if I'm taking a test that's a nationwide test, why can't I then automatically be licensed in every other state? Like,
girl, you're preaching to the choir. Like, Because there's also a national test you take. Like the tests we take, we're all have national as the first letter in them.
Yeah.
And yet it's the same situation, like, because I've actually, and Hannah too, we've worked in 2 different states.
Mm-hmm.
So I started and got my first license in Ohio, where I'm from. And then I moved here when I was 2 years into my license, but I still hadn't taken the independent test yet, the LCPC. So I had to do endorsing, which is what that looks like when you go from one state to another with our license, is like, if there aren't any extra requirements, you can just apply for endorsement, which is just
And
transferring.
then pay for it.
Oh, I paid probably like upwards of $500,
Yep.
and they would lose things or say they didn't get certain forms, so then I had to resend. And that whole process took me like upwards of 6 months. I mean, I also wasn't quite moving my ass about it. Like, if I maybe would have like really sped through it, it probably would take me a lot less. But as a normal person who was working a full-time job and, you know, paying for my life and stuff like that, and not totally devoted to this, it took me about probably 6 months because I would hear back. And it was all through mail, guys, because this is 2014. So I did all this through snail mail. So I wasn't getting emails with attachments saying you missing this form. I had to then like mail another thing to another place and then mail my college, university, and have them mail something. And so I had to do stages of that several times. But I'm lucky in that lucky, quote unquote, in that Ohio is such a strict state to get licensed in that other than like California or other places that have even stricter ones, I can endorse pretty easily, or my license translates pretty easily, because Ohio is so strict in terms of being even a program you can attend. So, yeah. But like, I would never move to California, because in California, you have to go back to fucking school and take extra classes to get licensed there. And I would have to like fall in love with a movie star or something to do that.
We'll figure that out. You know what? I'll bring you guys over for LA Comic Con one day, and we'll introduce you to a movie star. I mean, I will say this. You know, obviously, I'm biased towards California. You know, with regards to the licensure, I have a friend who I worked with when I was working in the psych hospital. She had been a licensed social worker in Missouri. Like, she had been licensed for many years. And then she had actually worked in like many states because her husband was a travel nurse. And so she like had worked all over. So she had all this experience, all this stuff. When she came to California, they were like, oh, well, we don't recognize your license. And it's like, but it's a license is like, it's mind boggling to me. I recognize that I'm very blessed that like, okay, if I get licensed in California, it would be very easy for me to then like get that. You can go to another state, because California, I don't know if there's a state that has a higher like strictness than California. They are so strict with like literally everything, and it is ridiculous. I mean, I've not taken the exam yet. Obviously, I'm still in school, but my brother has told me about it. My coworkers, like my supervisor, told me that like they have studied for the licensure exam, and it's like nothing at all related to clinical work.
It's like a game you have to figure out. It's like a pattern you have to, that's why I tell my supervisees, take the practice questions over and over and over again until you learn the way that they think. It's like you have to learn the game. And then once you know the game, but it has literally nothing to do with what you actually do clinically. Like an example would be, they propose a case study to you, right? And then they say, like, what assessments would you give them? And you're like, well, I would give them all the assessments. What are you talking about? I would ask them all the questions. And they're like, no, why would you ask her about her finances? She clearly isn't about her finances. I'm like, because I would ask every client about their finances. What are you talking about? And so that's what I mean. You have to almost forget, ironically, the 2 years of practice you've gotten under your belt. You have to unlearn the actual experience you've gotten, learn this dumb test, and then immediately disassociate it out of your brain like I did, until you have to show your supervisee the questions, and then you have a full body flashback where I'm like, oh, I remember I went through it with the supervisee like a year or so ago, and I was like, oh God. Like I really had like rejected it out of my brain, and looking through the questions again, I was like, this is so fucking stupid. Like I was getting so mad going over the practice questions with her and trying to like not be ranting and raving as we were doing them together.
So the other thing that I was going to say is that, so I went to school in Michigan, but decided to move to Illinois. And I actually had to take 2 extra classes for the license here. And the other really weird thing about Michigan is that even though Blue Cross Blue Shield accepts licensed marriage and family therapists, in general, in most states, they don't have that designation in the state of Michigan. So in the state of Michigan, instead of getting an LMFT, which is a licensed marriage and family therapist, you have to get an LC, like an LCPC. So I got trained to get 2 different licenses, and then still had to take extra classes in order to approve the class list to take the exam. So what ended up happening when I came here is I got the AMFT license, which is a license that you can get without having to take any exam. The license is good for 5 years, and you have to get a certain amount of relational hours, as well as at least 100 hours of supervision under an approved supervisor who's an LMFT. So, and then you have to take an exam, and that exam is basically the history of family therapy. So it's like a history test is the understanding that I keep getting. So I never did the LMFT here because I got my hours for my LCPC, and you don't really need both licenses. You really don't. Like, did I have to do 8 months of an internship? Did I have to do a bunch of extra shit? Absolutely. Just to get that designation. But then I never took the test because it's like, I'm not going to give the state more fucking of my money. I'm not going to give them more fucking money to do the same thing that I'm already doing. So what I tell people is I don't have an LMFT, but I am trained as a marriage and family therapist. I think on my, what is it called? On my actual degree, I think it's marriage, family, and group therapy is how I think they say it. So I always get confused because they said it a different way.
Yeah. No, that's like the certified in my license. So we have 2 C's. It's LCSWC, and it's licensed clinical social, or nope, I did it wrong. See, licensed certified social worker clinical. Too many letters.
Because a license and certification are fairly 2 different things.
Well, and also what's dumb in like Ohio, it's LPCC, and it's like, this is what I'm talking about. I don't know if I believe in states' rights, y'all, because this kind of shit is so fucking stupid. Yeah. The way we're obsessed in this country with like every state doing their own thing, it's like it affects us on these levels too. Like, it's to the point where I would encourage people listening that if you know where you want to end up long term, if you can go to school there, or at least like get your license there, even if you graduate from a different state, like do that. If you can save yourself the hassle of at least like knowing, if you know where you're going to be, like do that. It's such a bitch to like do the translating of that.
Transferring, yeah.
Well, and there's so many different rules. Different states have different rules. Like I was told in grad school, if you get a license in a state, you always have to maintain that license in that state. That not doing that is like a bad thing. There's all kinds of shit that they fucking told us about what we would be allowed and not allowed to do. And it's confusing. And it's one of the things. So when Brittany brought up, we have a whole sheet. We get a lot of people who listen to us who are going to school to be therapists. And so we have the sheet of like tips of like the stuff that they don't tell you when you go to grad school that we just email people with a list of books of like, here, if this is what you want to do, you should read these books, you should go to school. So what I did is I went to school in Michigan, but then I started my licensing process in Illinois. I didn't do anything in Michigan with a license. I came here, started the license because that was the best thing that I heard to do. If I would have started in Michigan, I would have waited to be vetted, because once you get your full license, then you have to wait to be vetted in order for you to pay, just have to pay a fee if you go to another state versus having to take something over again. It's so bonkers, and they don't tell you any of that stuff in grad school.
No,
none of it.
It's really interesting, and I want to make sure we get into like actual therapy work. But like, it's really funny for me, I'm doing my doctorate in an online school. So when I was doing my practicum, we're sitting in the course and we're all like talking together, like a group supervision. the school officially like meets the criteria for California's licensure, but yet the vast majority of students are not in California. They're in other states and other countries because it's like okay, so when we're doing the practicum, like the teacher had to basically like tell people, okay, like when you're like these practicum requirements are for our school for this. But other states and other countries might have their own. And so you might also have to do extra. And all these students are like, what? Like, and so if there's anything that I would recommend to any listener who is considering going to be a therapist, look into it.
Go to an accredited program. If I can give anybody any advice, it's go to an accredited program. It will fuck you royally to not do it.
I agree. Go to an accredited program, but also look into like this. Let's say, like Brittany said, if you know what state you want to end up in, look at what their requirements are, because just because you graduate from the school in this state, that might not be enough for another state, and then you might have to end up retaking stuff. Because I did my master's in social work from Israel, and I came and I have one of my classmates. She's from Ohio. State of Ohio totally accepted the master's degree. She was able to just go straight into her licensure program. California was like, no, you have to redo the whole master's program. I was like, how about I don't? Like, no. So, look into all this stuff. There's unfortunately a lot of confusion, because every state is different. And so start there. Like, okay, what state would I ideally like to live in? Okay, let's start there and then figure out what their requirements are and go from there, because it is a lot. But as we will learn, as we talk about what it's actually like to do the therapy, a majority of work that therapists do, whether they're psychologists or social workers or LCPCs or LMFTs, is you're working with individuals that are part of a family system. Surprisingly enough, most humans are part of a family system. Whether it's a biological family system or adoptive or whatever, I know it's strange to imagine that humans have family systems. So I'd like us to talk about how do you guys, without sounding like lame, work with. The question was in my head and it sounded so smart, and then I just decided to no.
Well, I might be able to jump in here, Benjamin. So what is the difference, I would say, if you're working with children and families versus someone who just only does individual therapy? So like children, families, and couples, what is that? What do you feel like the differences are there?
I can start just talking about the child part. Is one, you have to, in my opinion, and I guess I think about this for all therapists, and not enough therapists are like this. I'm just like really taking this opportunity to
lay it all out there.
Be hardcore. Is you have to be playful and silly, and you have to be connected to your inner child. I think that's good for all therapists, because a lot of the stuff I do with adults, I pull from seeing the child within them, not to sound too woo-woo, but like, and apply the same stuff. So I think that working with kids primarily in the beginning of my career, I think has done me wonders with working with adults and seeing them as kids. So you have to be playful. You have to meet kids where they're at. And what I mean by that is don't expect kids to act like adults. I know that seems like a very simple thing to say, but we as adults can't almost help ourselves from projecting our adult brains onto children and then getting frustrated with them because they're not acting like adults. And so that's where you as a therapist have to be clocking your ego, clocking you. And also I think to work with kids, you have to like kids. Mm-hmm. And that's just I just need to say that.
Obvious, but it needs to be said.
And also you have to be able to know that you can work with kids. And what I mean by that is, I remember being in my grad program and I hadn't started my practicum yet, but I was in the child therapy program. So I knew I was going to work with kids in my practicum. And I was in a class with a woman who's a little bit older than me, and she was a mom. So I was kind of worried that this also would be hard if I had kids. Like, she was like, had started her practicum, and I overheard her talking about how she would go home and like cry every day. And I was like, oh shit, like, is this gonna wreck me to work with kids? Like, is it gonna just wreck me emotionally? And so I find that I'm just very lucky. I don't know how else to describe it. I don't think I can take more credit than this, in that I'm a really good compartmentalizer. So I think if you're a naturally good compartmentalizer, you might be able to work with kids, because for some reason, and maybe this is the ADHD, I would hear the most horrific stories every day, because my first population was working with real kids who'd gone through a lot. And I would just leave work and I'd be bebopping, like no thoughts in my head. I would hear the worst thing you'd ever heard in your life. And then I would just go, oh, work's over, time to go home and hang out. And I would just like bebop to my car. So, and I know not everybody can do that. And I've worked with people who couldn't do it after a while working with kids. So if you have to be honest with yourself about if you're going to be too wrecked working with kids, if like you're too, I don't know, vulnerable to that. And there's no shame in that, because it is really hard working with kids, especially if you're going to work with populations of kids that like foster kids, adopted kids, you're going to work with kids who have trauma eventually. And so you're going to have to hear really hard things, and you have to deal and make it not a big deal.
Well, and that's what I always say to people, too. Like, you have to be able to, because I started off the beginning of my career working with kids. I thought I was going to work with kids under 10 for the rest of my life. Now I'm like, nah, 16 years are up. I can't.
Which happens to a lot of people.
Yeah. I lost the energy. I'm like, I'm done. Mm-hmm. Is to be able to put yourself back in the shoes of a teenager or a kid, or to think like a kid. Because it's like, when kids are going through something, and as an adult, you're like, well, that's not the worst thing they're ever going to go through in their life. And it's like, well, you know that because you're an adult and you've been through it. But in this moment, this is the worst thing that this child or adolescent or whatever, that first breakup, that first friend breakup, that is the worst thing that's happened to them in their entire life, because their entire life has only been 10 to 16 years.
Yeah, this is the biggest heartbreak they've ever had.
Right. So being able to put yourself back there. So
I think, just to be more concrete about it, you have to keep up with what kids are into. That's also something my advisor in grad school, who was a play therapist, like a baddie within the play therapist world, Dr. Diane Fry. And she was like, probably in her 60s, and she still knew like current cartoons. She was like, you have to watch kid cartoons, you have to watch kid shows, you have to know what they're into. Like, I tell supervisees, like, get on TikTok. You have to have those apps on your phone, whether you like it or not. You're not too good for it. Also, TikTok is awesome, and I watch it all day long. But like I work with kids and teenagers, and they will be routinely shocked that I know what they're talking about. And you have to know what they're talking about. You need to know the current slang. You need to know the current trends. You have to know, like, you don't say left me on red anymore. You say left me on delivered. Like, you have to understand these things to work with kids and teenagers. And you also have to be able to not get hung up on concepts like theory and things like that in very strict ways, because you'll have kids say things like looking contact instead of eye contact, and you don't have to. I didn't like when I worked with that 6-year-old who would say that. I wasn't going to correct her every time and be like, no, it's eye contact. Like, you have to adapt your language, really learn how to break things down, which is frustrating. And I get why people eventually burn out of working with kids or don't want to work with kids entirely, because your brain does have to work harder to use a vocabulary in a context that they understand, and that does take extra work. Also, if you're working with kids, you have to use more play. And so, like, I'm only on Zoom right now, so I don't see any kids younger than 10, just because I don't expect a kid younger than 10 to, like, maintain concentration on Zoom. Like, or below 8. I actually work with a 9-year-old right now, but I'm also assessing them, like, can they hang out on Zoom? And if they're getting distracted, if they're playing things on there, if it's boring, like, I'm not going to make a kid see me on Zoom who can't handle it or doesn't like it. So, but I have like the Ungame saved on my Google Chrome, Ungame. It's a very popular therapy game, basically a deck of cards with questions. I have Uno that I can play electronically. I use the whiteboard to draw, and sometimes I'll have kids like draw me your family. Like, let's play tic-tac-toe. Like, let's play MASH. Kids love playing MASH. And then they want to do MASH on you. And then you have to decide how, like, much you're going to tell kids about, like, your dreams and where you want to live and what color you want your wedding dress to be. You know? And who do you want to marry as a celebrity? And so you have to be playful. You have to be okay just shooting the shit, too. Like, the amount of times I will spend a whole session talking about D&D, actually. I have a kid that I talk about D&D a lot with. So luckily I've played D&D. So I kind of know what he's talking about. And, like, video games. Talk about The Sims. Talk about Marvel. Talk about, like, Halloween. And if their parents were listening, they might not be happy with our sessions because it might just sound like they're paying a bunch of money for adults to small talk, to chit chat with their kid for an hour for weeks and weeks and weeks. But like I say a lot on our podcast, kids are very rarely choosing to go to therapy, or they're very rarely the driving force. So therapy is something a lot of times that's happening to a kid by the adults in their life. So this chit-chatting process is how you build rapport with kids. You can't expect them to come in fully loaded with their goals for therapy, basically. That's something you kind of come up with together and as you're chatting. And you have to figure out, like, what they care about. You know, they don't necessarily want to, like, I want to work on my anxiety, so I want to develop coping skills. It might be more like, I want to stop getting in trouble for, like, leaving math class. Okay, what does that look like? But they might have to tell you a bunch of stories that mean nothing-ish. Before they get to, like, oh, you know, actually I did have a problem yesterday. And I'm like, oh, interesting. What happened? Well, I got in trouble. And I'm like, oh, okay. But when a kid starts giving you that thread, don't pull on it too hard. You're like, okay, we're finally talking about this.
Then you freak them out and they're like, whoa, 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 whoa.
And I would
They
say
startle
also,
easily.
like, yeah. So if you, like, I think I have a very childlike personality, and I think that's why I like working with kids. But when I work with kids in person, I would get on the ground and do therapy with them. Like, we'd both sit on the ground together. Sometimes what I used to love to do is make collages together. So I would, like, constantly be stealing magazines out of waiting rooms and stuff like that. And, from other jobs that didn't pay me enough. And use those in private practice work. And then it's really interesting to do that work with kids. I've done cartwheels with kids. I've gone on walks with kids.
Basketball.
I've screamed at the top of my lungs with kids. So you have to really be adaptable. You have to be playful. You have to be patient. And all those things are different than working with adults. What's nice about working with adults, which is why I know people will choose to do it, is they come in and they usually, especially in outpatient, they know what they want.
Yeah.
Or they have an idea of what they want and they're ready to work. And you can kind of get in there and you can get philosophical and you can have long, interesting discussions. You're not going to have that working with kids. That's just the long and the short of it. And that is frustrating. Yeah. And it can feel like when I've worked with kids a lot and then I work with adults, I'm like, oh, fuck, they're having like a conversation. And that is nice. And that's why I think it's good to have a balanced caseload too. Like, I work with a handful of kids and teenagers and I also work with a handful of adults. So I would say that's what's really different working with kids than another population. But I've done a lot of talking, so I can throw to you, to Hannah, about the family and couples part.
And one thing that I just wanted to add is I was one of those people so at my school, we did a practicum and then we did an internship. So the practicum only lasted for a semester. I don't know if that's how it is for everybody or not. But anyway, I did a practicum at an elementary school. And I was one of those people who now I realize with my own trauma that I had, I could not work with kids all the time. It was too much. I was coming home and crying every day and really, really struggled I just couldn't handle it. And so, but I do work with kids sometimes, but I just they can't be my main focus. Like, I can't only work with kids.
Yeah.
And so kind of the way that I look at it is in terms of, so just a little bit about working with kids. The way that I do it is kind of, I lecture the parents first, and I'm like, I just need to let you know that this is not going to look like what you think it's going to look like.
Yep.
And I will not be taking everything that you tell me and presenting it to the child. My experience is, this is kind of how I think about it. With kids, they're the expert. Right? They're the ones who are trying to help me understand what is going on, and if they even feel like they need help with it, because Brittany's exactly right. Kids are not picking to come. And my hope really, and what my hope is for kids, is that they have a good enough experience with me that when they get to the point where they're old enough to kind of deal with some of the concepts that they can't do as a kid because they don't have the brain development. I want them to be able to go to therapy as adults, because I get a lot of adults who are in their 30s who had one terrible experience with therapy when they were a kid and never went back.
Oh my gosh, that's so true.
And so it happens all the time. So what I tell parents is, I'm out here trying to give your kid as good of an experience as I can, because there are going to be things that they're going to want to work on when they're older. And I want them to feel good about going to talk to somebody. So that's, and I tell the parents that, and I'm like, if you got a problem with that, and I've had some pushback with parents who really want me to like lecture their kid about the stuff they're doing at home. And I'm like, that's not how this shit works. I'm not doing that.
I'm not paying to make your kid behave.
I'm not your enforcer.
Exactly. Exactly. And so that's just my little bit about working with kids. When you're working with couples, you are the expert. I am the boss. I am the boss of the room.
That's so real.
I am the boss of what we're going to be talking about. I am the boss of telling you to shut your fucking mouths because this is not working or going anywhere. And so that's the biggest difference for me with a couple. Some of the other things that I do, some of the stuff that I learned in my training. So I took like 3 couples counseling classes. I took like 5 or 6 family systems classes or family therapy classes in my program. And so something that I learned, and I've worked with a lot of couples. I currently am not working with any because I refuse to do it on Zoom. And I will only see them in person. And I've tried to be more flexible about that. But during the pandemic, just had a lot of really bad experiences with couples therapy over Zoom. And also probably because it was also the pandemic. And people were just out of their minds anyway. But something that I do with couples, there's a couple of different things that I do with couples that I think is a little bit different. So one, they absolutely have homework. There's no getting around homework. If you can only do this while you're in front of me for 1 hour a week, that's not going to make any change. You have to be able to go home. You have to be able to practice it and then come back and we'll talk about how hard it was, how easy it was, what it felt like. And then and I talk to people a lot about how we have to find things that work for your relationship. Sometimes that's a lot of trial and error. And also shit is going to get hard. I also lecture couples about how hard and intense couples therapy is going to be, and that this is not going to be something that you can just come and show up for once a week and you just don't have to do anything. That's not what couples therapy is like at all. It's much more intensive, and it's a lot more work for me as a therapist because I have to be prepared to deal with a crisis. I have to be prepared to deal with teaching them how to do a skill. I have to prepare for a session, something for every session. And not that I don't prepare for individual sessions, but it's different with couples. And so part of what I do is I see a couple together first, and then I see them each individually. And I tell them when I see them together, I am doing an assessment. I will let you know whether or not you are appropriate for therapy. Because sometimes they're not. And I'm not out here trying to work myself to death when I got a couple where both people need to do their own individual work first. And that's just the fucking truth. Sometimes that's just the shit that has to be done. And so I do that with couples, and I have a couple of rules. So they get the rules at the 3rd session. The other reason why I see them individually is because you have to ask about domestic violence. You cannot ask domestic violence questions in front of a spouse. You cannot. That you absolutely have to meet with people individually, because domestic violence is across the board, happens to every socioeconomic status, everything. Like it's across the board. It happens everywhere to everyone. So that's why I see people individually, and then I come back and do the couple, and then we just focus on the relationship. And one of the other things, so there's no name calling in my sessions. There's no new topics in the last 10 minutes. I will shut you the fuck down. There's no taking home what we talk about in the room. What stays in the room stays in the room. And when you go home, you're going to be focusing on a skill, not on who's right or wrong. And yeah, and so I've worked with, as always, the most fun couples to work with are people who are newly in love and are just coming in. I really love premarital couples. They're the most fun to work with. They're still in love. They're very connected. They are willing to believe that I'm the boss. I have a lot of problems with one partner, and it hasn't always been men, so I'm just going to put it out there. It hasn't always been men. One part of the couple that really does not think I know what I'm talking about, and they will push back at me hard the whole time. So also, it's also me. They have to trust me, and they have to understand that I'm the expert. And I've had a couple sessions, a couple times I work with the couples where they come in for 4 or 5 sessions, and that's it. And I'm like, yeah, because you're not ready to do the work. And I'm not out here sweating it, trying to do I used to do backflips and jumps and all kinds of shit for couples. And I don't do that shit anymore because it's not effective and it's not helpful.
Yeah.
So that's the difference for me working with couples. And then the difference of working with a family is that you are still an expert. You go back to that expert role again, working with a family, because really what we're helping them figure out is what their roles are in their families, how they're getting their needs met in their families, whether or not that's a healthy need or a need that is coming from past trauma or past experiences. The thing that I tell people is the most different about working with a marriage and family therapist versus working with somebody who only sees adults and only does individuals is that I really look at the whole picture. A big part of being a family therapist is looking at the big picture a lot of the time and helping pull in information to help people in the family understand why they're responding the way that they are, what is triggering them, what is upsetting about the way that the system is currently working. So that's kind of like this is the difference. And when I work with couples, I'm very even. If I have an individual session with the wife, I have an individual session with the partner. And sometimes I have to do that. Sometimes I'd be like, you know what? Next week, I'm going to meet with you and I'm going to meet with you the next week because we got some shit we got to talk about. That's not going well in therapy. And with families, it's a lot more of what I think I focus on too is when I have a family in my office is trying to do something that's experiential in the moment. So we do things like sculpting, where I usually have the 10 or 11-year-old kid set the family up of how do they sit during dinner and what is everybody doing during dinner. Dinner is a really good, and also do they even sit at a table? Do they all eat as they come home from school or work or whatever and they never eat together, which is fine. But again, something is very interesting to know. And so I really feel like you're an expert with a couple, you're an expert with families, and that is a big part of the dynamic of how we can help people, especially when we're really looking at the relationship and not at the people. We're looking at the relationships, and that's what I'm assessing, and that's what I'm working on.
I mentioned to you guys before we started recording, I didn't do couples work because I had not been trained in it. And when I was brand new into my career, I'm not about to jump into that without proper training. But what I had done is the clinic that I was at would get a lot of families that were referred to therapy because their parents are going through the divorce. And so they would split the family amongst the different therapists. And so often I would have the kid, and then one therapist was doing the mom and dad together or the parents together. And then another therapist would do the whole family. And so I would be coordinating, we would work together. All the therapists would obviously be working together because we're all dealing with the same family. And it's very interesting because you really can see where the breakdowns occur. I remember this one family, I was seeing the child over Zoom because they lived further away, still within California. I can't see people outside of California. But
California's pretty big though.
it is. And so, telehealth is good for that. But I'm seeing the kid. And at the same time as I'm having the session with the kid, my coworker is having the session with the mom over telehealth also. But then the family would come in person for the family session because that therapist was like, family session needs to be in person. Like they need to get out of that environment to be able to handle things together as a family. The child, yes, was impacted by whatever was going on. The kid, teenager, it was 11, 12 years old. So, but like a lot of the interrelational work of the family system, you can't do that over telehealth, especially when there was issues like in this family where there was some concerns about abuse and domestic violence. Like we're not going to have them be talking about this when they're in their own home and I'm not there to really manage it. And so I remember sitting down with the other therapist and like, okay, this is what we're going through. Like obviously not sharing, confidential information, but like this is the general topics that we're trying to work on. And obviously they would sign releases so we could all discuss with each other. It's very interesting how like each therapist was seeing the same thing, but from a different perspective. Like we all saw the same problem in the family dynamic, but from a different side of things. And it was so interesting. And so like in that regards, I liked the family work because I wasn't doing the family work.
Yeah, you just got to see it.
I'm just working on, helping the teenager just manage it. Like, because like Brittany said, that teenager did not choose to come to therapy. They're now forced into therapy because his parents were going through shit. And it's unfortunate, but it happens. And so it's really important that like, okay, what do you want out of this time? We have 50 minutes. We're doing whatever you want. And if something comes up that's serious, then we will address it. But if you are, I'm going to take you at your word. If you're telling me you're fine, I have to trust you that you're being honest with me. And, fine. We want to, play games. We want to talk about whatever. And more often than not, the important stuff does come up. Because you spend so much time talking about the games, talking about things, because you give them that space to be in control. When in their family system, they don't get that.
One of the other things that I think is really important which is part of the reason why I stopped seeing couples via Zoom, is because it's so important to see how people physically interact with each other. When I can only see half of each person's face, I can't do shit. I can't tell how close they're sitting next to each other. I can't tell if they're looking at each other when they're talking. I can't tell anything. And so and I love working with couples. I really do. I miss it because it's fun for me. Like I like it. I like to see like what's going on and like how I can help and what I can do. And I feel the same way about families. And a big part of it is you have to see how they interact with each other. You have to be able to see that, and you have to be able to in a safe space. And I think you're absolutely right that they have to be out of their own surroundings in order to even be able to talk about things in any kind of way outside of the house. Because also families have, those silent rules about we don't talk to other people about what happens in our house. And if I can tell that the kid is looking at the parents every time they're saying something, that helps me understand there's something else going on here that they are not telling me. And again, not like, oh, like fuck them, they're not telling me what's going on. But like there's something else here that is more serious and more intense that is happening. And it helps me be aware of that. And help me also, in some ways, it helps you protect the other parts of the family when you're aware that there's either way, there's something else going on that they're not able to share at this time.
Hello, dear listeners. This is Benjamin, co-host. This was just part one of this amazing conversation with Brittany and Hannah, all about child therapy and marriage and family therapy. Stay tuned. We will have part two coming soon.